You're listening to the Business and Life Conversations podcast with Angela Henderson, episode 80. Hey there, you're listening to the Business and Life Conversations podcast. My name is Angela Henderson, and on this show, we talk about improving your business, life, or both by having amazing and rich conversations with brilliant guests who will inspire you and who will give you tips and tricks to help you grow both in life and in business. Well, hey there, and welcome back to another awesome episode of the Business and Life Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Ange from Angela Henderson Consulting, where I'm a business consultant and coach who has helped hundreds of women business owners get all the pieces in place to have consistent 5-figure months and then on to 6-figure years without burning out in the process. Podcasting is so powerful in so many different ways. I know with starting my own podcast 80 weeks ago, gosh, 80 weeks ago seems so long ago. But starting this podcast, I've seen so many benefits, but I've equally seen amazing benefits from being a guest on other podcasts. It has opened up doors. It has created connections. It has created opportunities. And I've started to be able to, impact my mission by 2025 is to be able to support and guide over 2,000 women business owners. And the podcast allows me to do that by it being one of my mechanisms for tools. So podcasting is just simply amazing. And I'm thrilled today to have Jessica on the show from Interview Connections talking about how to leverage the billion-dollar podcasting industry right now to help with your own business growth. Jessica is an absolute legend. She's been in podcasting for a very, very long time. And I can't wait to get into this episode where we're going to chat about what types of entrepreneurs should be leveraging podcast interviews, what are the key benefits of leveraging podcast interviews for business growth, and should businesses start their own podcast, or could they leverage off of the back of other people's podcast interviews? And there's so much other juiciness that's going to happen, so stay tuned. But before we hop straight into this amazing episode, I'd like to remind you that if you enjoy this episode, I would love for you to share your key takeaway, a fun fact, or anything you'd love to share about the podcast over on your Instagram stories and tagging me, Angela Henderson Consulting. Also, this episode is sponsored by my 12-month group coaching program, Profit Pillars, my 12-month group coaching program for women business owners who are ready to take action to grow profitable businesses. The program includes my complete profit pillar training systems with videos, PDFs, guides, and more, monthly live strategy sessions, monthly hot seat sessions, monthly mastermind with guest experts, 24/7 access to a private Facebook community, world-class members, support, and special bonuses and secrets along the way. To learn more about my 12-month group coaching program, simply head to angelahenderson.com.au and click on the button that says, I want to hit 5K months. Welcome to the show, Jess.
Hey, Angela. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here today. Now, I know it is nighttime over the United States. What time is it there for you?
It's just after 7 o'clock here tonight.
After 7 o'clock. And we were just giggling before we press record. There's a lot of listeners out there who know the struggle is real with the juggle of motherhood and businesses. And you and I were catching up, and we probably could have kept talking for a very long time. But then you're like,
yeah.
Ange, my babysitter, we gotta roll here. We've got 45, 7:45. She's gonna be out. So for those moms out there, just realize that as business owners, we're always juggling. All right, and it's okay. Yeah. And it is part of the normal. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. You've got to have kind of your little, your book of babysitters. And, originally I was like, 7 o'clock, it's fine. But then I looked at my husband and I share our Google calendars, and I was like, he has a meeting at 7:30, which means he has to leave at 7 and I have to start this interview at 7. So I'm texting my babysitter, hey, Michelle, can you come over? So we always make things work, but just know that you're not alone out there if you're feeling the pinch or you're feeling the struggle. Now, listen, you and I have only kind of been introduced to each other, and it was through a random Facebook group that I actually found you. It was like someone tagged something and then tagged something, and then I found out about this amazing, business that you have that we're going to talk about shortly. And it's a super powerful topic that I want to talk about today, about how to leverage the billion-dollar podcasting industry, because podcasting is such an untapped resource by so many business owners. And so having you today to really shed some light on it, I think is going to open up a few eyes for people.
Yeah, I'm excited because it's such an incredible medium. I'm so passionate about the power of it, not only for business and lead generation, but really the impact that sharing your story has on people. I mean, honestly, in the first 5 minutes of this podcast, I guarantee there's a mom in the audience that's like, oh my God, I'm not alone with this. So I'm so passionate about this strategy and this medium. So I'm so excited to be here.
Now, before we get into kind of the nitty gritty about what we're going to be talking about today, the $1 billion podcast industry, I always like to ask a little bit of a fun question so that the audience can get to know you a little bit more, Jess. And so my question to you is even though it's podcast related, I'd love to know, what is your top podcast interview that you've either done or guest interview that you've appeared on?
Oh my gosh. You know what the first one came to mind is? I'll just go with that. I don't know if it really is my favorite, but the most fun appearance that I had on a podcast was on the Walking Dead cast. And it was my favorite because it was totally out of the realm of what I normally talk about. I'm good friends with the host of the #1 fan podcast for the Walking Dead.
Wow, that's super fun.
Yeah, I met him at a podcasting. No, well, yeah, I did meet him at a podcasting conference, but I kind of connected with him just over, social media, and then we met and became friends. But I actually don't watch that show anymore, but because it's been on for forever.
Yes.
But yeah, he was like, oh, do you want to come on and break down the show with me on an episode? So that was just so fun. And then somebody through business was like, I heard you on the Walking Dead podcast. So that was really fun.
So Walking Dead podcast. And like you said, it was probably just so, just out of the realm and just so new that, again, how could you not have fun on it?
Yeah, it was a very different type of show. And he was like, oh, you're pretty good at breaking, because you have to watch the show and take notes. I had to come prepared for that episode to do my homework.
And so obviously you appear on podcasts, you have your own podcast. So can you tell us a little bit about just you, where you've come from and what you're currently up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my business in 2013 as a virtual assistant. And I know, Angela, we've been talking about how you're going to be doing more Pinterest and stuff. So I don't know if I mentioned this to you. I think I probably did, but I did Pinterest as a virtual assistant. That was the first thing that I did when I started my business back in 2013. I took a course on Pinterest, and that was the first kind of area of expertise that I, established myself as when I was first starting out. Because to grow in online business, you really need to establish yourself as an expert. So I started my business doing that, and personally did not feel super passionate about Pinterest. So I didn't keep doing that. But then I was booking people for interviews on podcasts. And that was something where I was like, okay, this is awesome. Nobody else is doing this. People really like it. They're seeing results. Everyone's always excited when they get connected for an interview. And I'm like, there's something here. So I created my business Interview Connections in 2013, and it has just grown so much. I started my podcast in 2014 and started, speaking on my podcast, and I spoke at Podcast Movement that first year in business, and it's just grown exponentially since then. So I guest on, at least 4 shows a month. I'm a guest on another show. My business partner and I co-host our show called Rock the Podcast. So every Monday we have an episode which just teaches entrepreneurs how to leverage podcast guesting. So that's a little bit about my business story in a nutshell.
Gosh. And so again, Pinterest, again, 2 platforms, right? Pinterest and podcasting. Again, as you know, I'm testing both of these. Listen, I take that back. Podcasting, I've obviously been doing my own now. We're about to hit episode, I don't know, etc. So that's going crazy. Episode 100 will come up very shortly. So that's, 1 a week. Really cool. I hear you. I'm on I think I had 6 podcast guest interviews this week alone. So listen, I'm all about podcasting, but I also, because I want to break into the US market, and you all love Pinterest over there. All right. Not so much the Aussies. Okay. It's another mechanism that we're testing, right? We'll see what happens, but again, Pinterest is quite complex, right? There's, I think it's important, if you're thinking about that, podcasting, you literally just have to have some headphones, have a microphone, and be ready to chat about whatever your expertise is. Pinterest, again, I've had to hire a Pinterest expert. We have to have different titles, because I've got so much content, I think we've got to get 400 graphics, done.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Be SEO optimized. It is a lot, of time that has to go in for potentially ROI, yes, but it's a long term, I think. Whereas podcasting, you're getting access to an audience ASAP once that episode drops.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is a strategy where like I talk a lot about consistency and momentum and really like going all in on your podcasting strategy, because you really do need to be appearing consistently on at least a show a week to really see those results. Because for me, if I'm on a show every single week and, maybe once a month, someone says, "Hey, I heard you on this podcast and I, would love to learn more about how we can work together, or, can I learn more about your services?" For me, if one person reaches out from a show, I'm thrilled because they're usually super high qualified. They know my message, they get it, they're enrolled, they trust me. So that really is how podcast guesting works. But if you're only on one show every other month, it takes forever to really be heard enough to have people reach out and want to work with you. And that is the thing about podcast guesting, is that when people do reach out, they are ready for a sales call for the most part. I talk a lot about consult with my clients on what kind of calls to action and like getting people into your community and everything. But for me, my experience is when I'm on a podcast and somebody reaches out, they're ready for a sales call.
And I agree. Like I know I just signed 6 new one-to-one coaching clients this last week, but 2 weeks before that, I'd signed 3 new coaching clients. And when I asked them where had they found me, like what was the primary thing? And they said, listen, one said, you've been my like virtual mentor for the last 6 months. And I knew finally like I was ready to, step up. And the other 2 is they heard me on a guest podcast. And the other one had heard me on my own, was just like, listen, they all consistently 3 said, because I said the word fuck, they were okay with me. Like they were okay to hire me. And some people like it, some people don't. Right. And I don't use that word often. But it does come out. Either I get super excited sometimes. I'm like, so interesting, right? Because again, they can feel your personality. They can go, yes, you repel people and you attract people. And again, you can't get that when you're reading a blog post or a Pinterest, because you don't get that emotional component to it.
Oh my God, I love it. And we just did an episode recently on our show about our core values. And one of our core values is authenticity. And I feel like that's a perfect example of what you just shared. Like you show your authentic self. You don't like come all buttoned up. Like you just, if you want to curse every now and then because it like makes an impact, or whatever reason, like people hear that and they're just like, I like her, like she's real, and that's your authentic self. Because authentic is like kind of a buzzword that gets thrown around, but that I just feel like a really good example of like, that is you being authentic. And, for me, it's just being honest about like, you know what, I did get a babysitter at 3:00 because I friggin' forgot to check my husband's Google calendar, like that's just me being authentic. So I think that's the power. People hear that and they're like, oh, I can relate to her, it's like honest. So that's
and not to mention that you're building that, the authentic piece, but you're also building your trust, credibility, and authority so much quicker on that buyer's journey. Like you've already kind of taken multiple steps before, having to, warm them much longer on the runway with different platforms. So super, super love podcasting. I know. So my question to you now is when you think back to when you first, you created really the podcast booking company when no one else was doing it. Why did you do that? Obviously, yes, you were doing Pinterest and you liked it, but did you see a gap in the market? Like what was it initially that kind of got you like, we need to do this?
Yeah. So, I got to give my dad a lot of credit. He's an entrepreneur and a business coach, and he was my first client. So when I was a new mom and I wanted to be home with my baby, who is now 6.5 years old, when I wanted to be home, my dad recommended that I start a virtual assistant company. And so really, as I was doing that, I was doing some client support work for him. He had already had his podcast. So he's been podcasting for like 7-8 years. And so he actually told me, like, why don't you book me on some podcasts? Why don't you find guests for my show? And so as I was doing that, I saw that there was a gap in the marketplace. So I started doing it for clients, like kind of on an hourly basis. Like as a VA, I'd bill them for however many hours I was working. And it really about May of 2013. So I had been doing my business for a couple of months. I realized, you know what? I really want to scale my business. And I don't just want to be sending my clients an invoice for $300 a month. Like it was not working for me. And I remember my dad coached me. He was my business coach for many years. And he said, listen, what of the services you're doing, I was doing Pinterest, I was doing podcast booking and client support. He goes, what is the most profitable for you? What do you enjoy the most? What do people find the most value in? Where is the demand? Like, so he asked me these questions and I'm like, honestly, of everything I'm doing, booking podcast interviews kind of meets all of those criteria. So then we really spent the summer and created my business and, came up with packages. So there was the opportunity to be profitable. Like if you can charge X amount and get it done in less time, you can then grow your profit. And that's an important thing with a service-based business, is giving yourself that opportunity to be profitable. So that's really how I got started in it. And for at least a year, if not more, there were no competitors. It was crazy. And it just grew like rapid fire.
Grew and grew. And did you see it grow more in the US than other parts of the world? Was like the US kind of like the early adapters leading the way?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I don't know of any booking companies that are outside the US. So as far as like my industry and the kind of company that I have, it's all based in the US. And then as far as podcasting, yeah, I mean, the vast majority of shows that, we're booking on and the vast majority of clients that we have are in the US. So yeah, it's interesting to see, but I do know that people are listening in all different countries. So I think that it's only a matter of time before people start really leveraging it more as a host and a guest in other countries.
I mean, you look at the amount of time people are spending in their cars, because not everyone is out of the corporate world yet, right? Or they're sitting at their corporate world, putting the headphones in, listening to even this podcast today or listening to it on their way to work, right? Like it is such an easy, it's like just transferable, right? You can be on an airplane, you can be anywhere listening to it. Whereas again, you've got to either have a phone to read the blog post or on Pinterest doing this, right? Like there's so much more complexities. Now, for those listeners that are out there, like I know what a podcast booking company does, but can you kind of explain what the role of a podcast booking company is so that other people can start to put the pieces together?
Yeah. So we're like, do you guys have Match.com in Australia?
Gosh, you think I should be able to answer that, but is that the one like the dating scene?
So yeah, this is like a high, like, so think of it like a high-end dating. So not like a Tinder where it's just like swipe and choose, but like we're like a high-end matchmaking service, but we do it for podcasters and entrepreneurs.
Okay, gotcha. So, I like the analogy.
Yeah, I feel like that's like an easy way, because I could say we're like a boutique PR agency, and I do use that analogy for some people that I'm talking to, but it's really, because with PR agencies, there's a whole other complexity of like retainers and all these different mediums. So we're really like, we are a matchmaking company for entrepreneurs who are doing podcasting. So our clients are entrepreneurs who want to be booked as a guest on podcasts. We do have a service as well for hosts who need help finding guests, and we're typically doing that for hosts that like they need really interesting guests that aren't like actively pitching them. Like they want to because so many business podcasters, I'm sure you get pitches all the time from people who want to be on your show. So there is not as much of a demand for the service of hosts needing someone to find them guests, unless again, it's like a really, really niche show. So that's what we do. So yeah, our clients pay us to get them placed as a guest on shows that are in their niche, speak into their target audience.
Dude, fantastic. And for those that are also out there, they might be, oh, this isn't for me. This isn't, I don't know. Talk to me, what types of entrepreneurs should be leveraging podcast interviews?
Yeah. So this is a strategy that is perfect for service-based entrepreneurs. So if you're a business coach or any type of coach or a consultant, an agency, you are performing a service for your clients, this is going to be fantastic for you. And the reason being, your clients, if they are getting a service from you, they need to trust you. They need to know you. They need to know that they can, get along with you. So it's perfect for service-based entrepreneurs. And I will also say it's even better for service-based entrepreneurs whose clients are worth multiple thousands of dollars. So they might not come in investing thousands of dollars up front. But if you have sort of an ascension model where, okay, they buy my course for $200, but then I know I can upgrade them into my coaching program, which is then $1,000. So over the course of a lifetime, one client is worth multiple thousands. And I say that because podcast listeners, they're really engaged, but they're also a little bit passive. Like they're not going to reach out to you usually until they're ready to buy. They might reach out and they might download your ebook that you promote, or they might follow you on social media, but until they are ready to talk to you, they're a little bit quiet. So to see an ROI, you want a price point that is high enough that just a couple of listeners taking action makes it a strategy that's worth doing long term.
Yeah, and I know even for myself, we've done some data around, and on average, it's taking people anywhere from 4.5 to 6 months before they'll have a strong touch point with me. And so, and that's for my own. I'm not talking about guest appearances or anything, but that's just for my own. And it is, and I would assume that it'll probably be relevant for some too. Do you know what I mean? That you got to keep showing up. You've got to be appearing. You've got to, and then be posting that on your socials. Like I was on this podcast this week. I was on this podcast this week. Like, and people are like, damn, if they're on that many podcasts, then like they must have something to say. They must be valuable.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I've heard it's 16 touch points in general before someone buys from you. And you just have to, this is also a strategy that I would recommend. I know that your listeners are kind of in like the first few years in business. So really look at this as a long-term strategy. When you are guesting consistently on podcasts every single month, number one, you're sharpening your message, which is incredibly important. I mean, when you're first starting out, you're getting clear, like, okay, what is my message? What is my approach to my business? And that you can't just know that on day one. You just have to start. And then the more you speak and the more you get interviewed, the more clear you become in what your message is. And it gets better and better every time.
Mm-hmm. And I couldn't agree more. And I guess that kind of leads into my question about those key benefits. Like, what are they when, leveraging those podcast interviews? And we've talked a little bit about it. You've got that trust building, that credibility, the authority. And then obviously, again, you're getting clearer and clearer on what you do, your messaging. Would you say like we're missing any of those other benefits?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely just amazing for lead generation. Like, and I guess we already talked about that a little bit, but that is the biggest benefit of it, is that not only are you generating leads, but you're generating really qualified leads. So you're actually getting people who hear, like anyone who's heard you talk for 30 minutes and reaches out is so qualified. Like they know they want you, because people will self-qualify themselves out.
Totally.
If they hear a full interview and they realize, oh, you know what, she kind of talked about who this is right for. I'm not really like, they won't reach out. But if someone hears this, especially with questions like, oh, who is this right for? If who I'm describing fits you, the listener, then there's just a higher likelihood that you're going to reach out and be right. So that's the power of podcast interviews, is that the leads you generate come to you feeling like they already know you, and then they're ready to work with you.
And I would also go a little bit one further. That too is not only the leads, but I also have found in my experience of just not only holding this podcast, but being on guests, is that the connections and long-term relationships that are there for you to make. So, like today we were talking about, oh, I'll connect you with this person. I can help you with this. And you're like, yep. And I can help you with this. And then it's just like from there, relation starts to build. And then when relation starts to build, like I can help you, you can help me. And then like it becomes this ecosystem that just keeps growing and growing. Would you agree?
Oh my gosh. Yes. That is something that we talk about a lot in our business. We just did a podcast guesting masterclass, and we're going to be doing another one real soon, depending on when people hear this. But yes, 110%. That's one of the things that I love to just share with people, of like, what would your life look like if every week you got on Zoom with somebody you had not met before, but is a good connection, and you guys talked for an hour and they interviewed you? Like, how would that transform your business? It would be incredible. And guess what? You don't have to put on a pantsuit and go to a chamber meeting. Like you can actually be in your pajama pants and share your message and have an impact. It's incredible.
Now, you talked a key word there, impact. And I'll tell you a funny story. I was at We Are Podcast here in Australia, and I was speaking, and I was on a panel with Pat Flynn, myself, Steph, and I'm trying to think the other person, Steph Taylor, a good friend of mine, and we're sitting there. I actually just started my podcast. So I think I was only episode 9 or something in. And the question for us as an impact it was actually an impact panel. And Pat Flynn, he spoke before me, and he's like, well, I'm making this impact, and I work with Pencils for Promise or Promises for Pencil, one of those ones. And I do this and I do that. And I was thinking, shit, like, dude, you're Pat Flynn, right? Like, you're making a much bigger impact. So I started talking, and I said, oh, listen, I've only had episode 9 and I've only done this. And Pat actually is like, I'm going to call you out here, Ange. And I was like, oh God, right? I was like, no, not now, right? But again, it was a very powerful conversation, because what he then talked about was, impact. And he goes, take the podcast away. He goes, think about impact collectively. So we were talking about that as like a room, right? And basically, there's like one stage where there's this particular person who was going to be harming her child because of a mental illness, right? And he's like, but because of your voice, Ange, because of your platform, you potentially saved that mom and baby, right? So we were talking about not minimizing like, oh, I've only been on one podcast episode, or I've only released 9, is that every podcast interview you're on, every podcast that I release, whatever that is, you're touching people's lives in so many ways. It could just be something very subtle, like today about those moms that are listening going, oh, thank goodness I'm not the only one. Like, so I do think it's important about realizing the impact, not only from a strategic point, but just indirectly that people are making.
Oh my gosh. I could not agree with you more. Yes. And it's easy to look at people like Pat Flynn and say like, well, I can't afford to build a school, yes. but I will tell you another story of, one of my favorite clients, Oscar Trimboli, who is also in Australia. He is an expert in deep listening. I mean, his expertise is amazing. It has helped me so much. The tips that he gives are so simple, but so profound and so impactful. And he had a listener write in to the host of the show that he was a guest on and said, I heard Oscar's tips on how to be a better listener, how to be a deeper listener. And I applied those tips, and it had an amazing positive impact on her marriage because she was able to listen and hear her spouse in a way that she wasn't able to before hearing the interview with Oscar. And it's just like, oh my gosh, like the impact that his podcast interview had on that household, that home is just, it was moving. It was so moving. So, and it's like the ripple effect that has then if they've got children and then mom and dad are getting along better because they're listening better. It's like, it's a lot. So yeah, building schools is amazing, but like just communicating better is a very positive impact.
Exactly right. So never minimize every episode that you're on, and again, as that's what you do is there's impact everywhere. And, I think it's important, podcasting or not, there's impact. And if you've got a platform and if you've got a business, I think there's almost a duty of care that you're utilizing those platforms to the complete fullest. So yes, I could go on that for a whole nother podcast. So now we talked about the benefits. We talked about, what does a podcasting, agency do, et cetera. How can businesses out there going, oh, well, should I just start my own, or should I do this? So or should I just get on podcast interviews? What are your thoughts about that? Because there's pros and cons of both. But again, in a world where we're super time poor, I know how much time it takes me to produce a podcast. Trust me. And I actually outsource everything else. I prepared. I probably spent 30 minutes, back and forth, us trying to find a time together. Then I researched, specific questions to ask you. And then I'll do the intro once this is done. So all up, I probably spent about an hour on each guest myself. And I don't outsource that to my team. I do that because I feel if you're coming on my show, I should take the time to get to know you. Then it goes to my team to produce, and then my team then kicks it back to my another part of my team, and then they distribute it out. So there's a lot of work that goes into starting your podcast. Whereas I'm going to assume you're going to say with podcast interviews, you just got to show up. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, as you just said it yourself, like producing, and hosting a podcast is a lot of work. It's a lot of time. It's a fair amount of money, especially when you're hiring and investing in, podcast producers and stuff like that. So being a guest is a lot easier because you do show up. It's really easy if you work with a booking agent who can just connect you with the show and then you show up. If you're doing it yourself, it is a fair amount of time. You got to figure out what shows are a good fit for you. You got to pitch them and follow up. So on either side, there is work. I will say it's probably less work to be a guest on podcasts. And it's also very beneficial because podcasters, their show is the centerpiece of their marketing. And I will credit Kelly Rhodes for really putting it that way. She came into our Facebook group and really shared why podcasting is the centerpiece of her multi-million-dollar marketing strategy, because she does her podcast and then all this other content, videos, live trainings, everything comes out of what she talks about in her podcast. When you go on somebody else's podcast, you are literally stepping into the spotlight of the centerpiece of their marketing strategy. So it's incredibly effective and powerful and efficient. Ultimately, I would love to see everyone do both, because it's great to go on other shows and get in front of new audiences, but you do want a place for those listeners to come hang out with you every week. So I love going on other shows, but then I love it when people hear me on another podcast and then like what I have to say and then come listen to my podcast. Because when you have your own show, you have the freedom to say whatever you want and to promote whatever you want. You know what I mean? Like, you're not in somebody else's house where you want to be mindful of the fact that it's their show, you know what I mean? And this is for their business. So there are a lot of benefits to doing both. When you're getting started, being a guest is a lot easier.
Yes, I would totally agree. But I equally agree with what you said, though, is that if you can leverage both as part of your overall strategy. So I just was working actually with a good friend of mine, Steph Taylor. She's a big podcaster too over here in Australia. And she had hired me to do a 2-hour strategy session with her last night. And we just mapped everything up. And, we know she's got her own podcast. It is such it's a tool, but she equally does an enormous amount of guest podcasting. Like, both of them go hand in hand in that overall, strategic plan. So it's super powerful. Now, some listeners out there will be going, all right, yes, but will I see the ROI right away? Or what does ROI look like? And I'd like for you just to talk a little bit about, do they see the ROI right away? Is it long-term? And ROI, is it just financial ROI, or are there other elements that people forget about?
So I really want to set clear expectations, because I don't want to, we've talked a lot about how amazing podcast guesting is and podcasting and everything. But I don't want people to walk away and start doing it and then be disappointed. Will you see an ROI right away? Probably not. You probably won't. Like, you'll do this you'll probably be in your first few months doing it and you're like, this isn't working. Nobody's reaching out to me. I'm not hearing back from anyone. This is not working. Okay. Just keep doing it. Like, you got to keep doing it. One of our core values is going all in. Like, you got to dedicate, I would say, a year to a strategy to really know if it works. Because it takes time. People might hear you once. They might, somebody might hear me. I'm sure people are going to hear me on this episode, and they're not going to be ready. And they're going to put me in the back pocket. They're going to be like, I'm not ready for it yet. And then a year, they're going to be like, you know what? I think I heard you on some podcast. They won't even remember. Yeah. But totally. They'll probably join the email list, or they'll join the Facebook group. So you got to think about that. People are not likely going to be ready for you as soon as they hear your episode, but you need to keep showing up if you want them to buy from you when they are ready.
Mm-hmm. And I also think that, it's not just about them buying from you. In my opinion, I think it's a component, yes, because everyone wants more sales, right? Everyone wants higher profit margins and revenue. But I also think people forget about the indirect ROI, which is increasing your brand awareness. And it's not just about by being on there, but it's also what happens after that episode goes live is a lot of responsibility on you as the business owner. Where are you sharing it? Where do you have it on your website as a separate, page about these are all the podcast interviews I've been on? Or do you have like a featured in spot on your homepage, which again adds that credibility. And that leads to also, again, some of the ROI is that authority building, the credibility, the brand awareness, and just being able to have that social proof. So, it might not be that tangible in the bank ROI, but it will come if you remain consistent.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because the social proof is so key. Because as a newer entrepreneur in your first few years, you're likely growing through word of mouth, through referrals. And let's just say, for example, somebody says, hey, my friend told me about you. They said I should look into what you do. You can say, awesome, I would love to meet with you. Hey, you know what? Why don't you check out this interview that I did on this podcast so you can get to know me more, and then let's have a call. So you can utilize it in your conversations with prospective clients, and then it boosts your credibility and social proof. So they see you you're then positioned as more of a celebrity guest or a celebrity expert, as opposed to just that person their friend told them about.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's you, and I also think for businesses who are starting off and then really want to, if they want to go personal brand on something later on too, like you can use it as a 2-prong approach for your current business. And again, if you are going off on that personal brand later on, so there's so much leverage. So just don't underestimate, things. And sometimes I also think people just overlook things, people have choices. Yeah. Be proactive and have a strategy, or don't. That's okay. But don't whinge and complain about it if you choose not to do it, right? So now for those listeners out there that are like, okay, I probably need to, you guys have convinced me, I need to probably start looking at, some form of podcasting in my business strategy. How can businesses connect with you?
Yeah. So we have a free Facebook group. It's called Guest Expert Profit Lab. This is a group for entrepreneurs who are, over the 6-figure point, and they're looking to really leverage this strategy to see results in their business. So you can go to interviewconnections.com/group to find us on Facebook. And we also have, if that's not quite you yet, then listen to our podcast. It's called Rock the Podcast.
Very, very fun name. Now, my final question to you is what do you know now that you wish you knew when you first started out in business?
Oh my gosh. I wish I knew that I should have hired someone for sales and marketing before team.
Okay.
And this is literally something that I've learned within the past year or so, that when you start hiring, a lot of times people start hiring for a service, for the operations part of their business. But you really want to make sure you're bringing in people to the sales and marketing side, so that way you're not the only sales driver. And this is something I've learned from Rhodes, who is one of our business mentors. So yeah, that is a big thing that I would.
It is. I mean, because if you don't have sales, then you're going to end up with nothing, right? Or not necessarily nothing, but it's going to be harder to scale potentially. Or, some people, So it's like, again, sales are a key component. Something I talk about with my clients all the time. Where are we bringing the sales in? So many people think that they just get distracted with shiny object syndrome, and I'm like, no, focus. You need sales for growth. Yeah. So yes. Yeah. And before we sign off, I just want to remind you that my team and I will also be putting together this whole transcription for this episode at angelahenderson.com.au. And as I mentioned earlier, if you've enjoyed this episode, I would love for you to share it, especially over on Instagram, just by tagging me at Angela Henderson Consulting, or really, you can share it wherever. I'm cool with that. I'd also love for you to subscribe and or leave a review. It's super great, not only for me, but equally to be able to, again, leave that impact for other people who might be struggling in their business. I hope you have a fabulous day, and I look forward to you joining me next week for another awesome episode of the Business and Life Conversations podcast. Thanks again, Jess, for everything.
Thanks, Angela.
Thanks for listening to the Business and Life Conversations podcast with Angela Henderson. www.angelahenderson.com.au